Thank you very much, Dr. David Delfoli, and congratulations on the Institute and the book. And we'll jump straight into the first panel discussion this morning. The title is Labor and Inequality. Dr. Elsa will moderate, and if I could invite the panelists, Professor Michelle Chelini, Dr. Muriel Perisse, Dr. Hwok and Junaidi Mansor. Professor Chelini, Dr. Perisse, Dr. Lee, and Junaidi Mansor. Over to you, Dr. Elsa.
Yes. So, thank you very much. I will introduce this roundtable on labor. I was saying very briefly that in the regulationist theory, when we study capitalism, we propose that there are 5 key institutions, but it's more meta-institutions, framing the capitalist system. And countries are different according to... Every country are framing the capitalism through these 5 institutions. But different will be in the content, of course, but also in the hierarchy of these institutions and in the complementarity between them. And the key institutions are the role of the state, what we call labor nexus, the regime of the competition, the openness, and the money, and money finance. So today, in the globalized finance world, it's considered sometimes that often that finance and money regime has taken the leadership and is imposing its logic and its constraints to the rest of the institution and is giving to capitalism, is driving capitalism through these norms and complementarities. In Europe, during our glorious 30s, it was the labor nexus and the share between capital and labor that was really the key of developing our capitalism, and we have to say it was very favorable to workers. In Malaysia, at the contrary, it has been the state, according to me, is the state economy relationship which has been at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, and this position hasn't been changed from the 70s until now, where it has been changed in Japan, it has been changed in Europe, it has been changed maybe 1 or 2 times already. In Malaysia, the hierarchy is dominated by the role of the state in the economy, the implication of the state in the economy. And that is really specific. And I think the role of the long-lasting hegemony of UMNO at the power is, of course, one of the explanations. But another characteristic of Malaysian capitalism is that the labor dimension that have been the key by us and the pinnacle in the 30 years after the World War II, here is the subaltern dimension. It means labor is playing a role in growth, but is never the leading force to political compromise, to never since 1970s. Before the war, it was more expressive and important, but after the 70s, is the subaltern one. So, the aim of this session is to bring labor back in, to give importance to labor in Malaysia nowadays. We will. So, labor is very important because it's at the same time engine of a source of growth. The quality of the labor is determinant for the type of production in the nation. But the labor also is the matrix of the distribution of the revenue in the society. And then it allows or not ladders, social mobility. It can be a key of the inequalities or not. So we will discuss this. So what is the role of the labor and what is the Malaysia, the social mobility, is it really upward at the moment? So Junaidi will discuss this point. What is the role of the wage inequalities in the overall inequalities in Malaysia? Hwok will touch this aspect. And but before entering the Malaysian world, we will make a detour with Michelle Pierre, which is an historian of wages, and we will explain how we, in Europe, in France, we can consider wages as a very important topic. In Malaysia, so Professor Jomo, in Question of Class, has written more than pages and pages, and we have all the tables of the evolution of the labor in this and this and this field, and the wages. So it has been extensively done in the 80s, but it was at the time very subversive and new. In Europe, this way of questioning the reality through the wages and the evolution of wages is very well developed, old also as a tradition, and interesting to understand the current days. So Michel Pierre will present it to you. And then Muriel is a very great specialist of wages in China and the link between labor law and the condition of workers in China. And she will make the comparative analysis between, not Malaysia, because it's beyond the possibilities, and it's good. It allows me to have some space in the French Academy, but she will make the link between France and China. So let's begin the session. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Salam alaikum, salam. Bonjour, because also French. All protocol observed. I will take the beginning, and I hope the pointer will point. Je sais pas, il marche pas. Ah, c'est vers l'ordinateur. Ah, ok. Non, je vais essayer. Okay. So, wage and globalization in the long run, since the 50s, main issue can be the title of my outline today. The issue of wage is quite important in economy because today an active on two in the world is an employee, Yes, no, this is the second one. Yes, one active in the world, is an employee paid by wage, and the global payroll represents perhaps 40% of global GDP. In advanced countries, wage currently account for 40 to 50% of GDP, 50 to 70% of household incomes, and 90% of the workforce. In emerging countries, the quantity are not so high, 35 to 40 of GDP, 40 to 50% of household incomes, and 50% of the workforce. And no, it goes too fast. Some question, elementary question, but a very complicated answer. Wage convergence in time or not, and wage equalization inside individual state or not. And it will be this morning for me in 20 minutes. I will try to make no more than this time. Just a checklist of the main issue and some example. And when the time is over, I will stop. 3 points. Oh. Okay, it's very sensitive, a pointer. Or I am too rough with the pointer, it depends. So, wage evolution from the 50s, wage dispersion, and wage policy. Wage evolution from the 50s through today. The wage is not something isolated. We have also, it is a part of a very differentiated system, salary scale. We have quite almost 1,000 of levels in a company. Sometimes you have not two people and you have not the same wage, and it is related to qualification, the individual, the responsibility, and also the place in the economic circuit, in the added value circuit. And with globalization, one can say no one labor market is closed, and the international labor market gets a growing importance. This is an example for France, the wage evolution since the 50s. As you can see, till the 80s, it was a big growth, around 3 times. And then since 30, 35 years, in France or in Germany or in most European countries, perhaps not America, but in most European countries, this evolution is really slower. And one can see a kind of reverse evolution. Between 50 and 18, wage in advanced countries grows faster than those or future emerging countries. And since the 80s, it is really the contrary. The growth is really faster in the emerging country. It's not a link of causality. It's more something with a mix between causality and simultaneity. And for instance, if it works, yeah, it's okay. Blue, it's a nice color. It's not my fault. It's just the PowerPoint, when you chose a slide, blue is coming, and I like this color. But you see, for example, since only 2000, wage level in Asia has become higher, around 2 times. World evolution is around 20% in 11 or 12 years. Then Africa, Latin America, and advanced countries were very, very slow. So except Middle East, for several reasons, except Middle East, the wage evolution is the more slower in these advanced countries. And for example, with statistic, since 20 years, the global GDP between 3 and 4% per year, average wage between 2%, so the half of the growth of GDP, but 1% only in advanced countries and 3 to 5% with a high level of heterogeneity in the emerging country. For example, India and Brazil around 3%, China 10%. I think it's too much. I have to correct my final version of PowerPoint if, for example, we put it on the website. There are a lot of issues in comparison. I could have the whole outline on this question, but I prefer to speak about something different. But one question is inflation rate. So if you have to compare in time or in space, you have to take in account the inflation rate. And this is in log value, but at those time Brazil had some, I forget, 500 or 300 per year inflation rate. So also in log value, you can say it's a noodle soup, quite noodle soup between India, France, South Africa, Brazil. And so when you compare, you have to take this as an account. It's just one example. Second point, yeah, I'm quite right in time. Second point, the wage dispersion. I propose to make distinction between something more statistical. Wage dispersion is something arithmetic distribution of value relative to the average, more or less important to the average, and disparities. This is more something socio-economic or socio-cultural evaluation of this dispersion. If we take in account or if we pay attention to the wage dispersion in geography, this is, for example, the situation in, this is in dollars, international dollars, but corrected by the purchasing power of the money, purchasing power parity, PPP. So, as you can see, the world average wage is per month, this is monthly average wage, per month around $1,500. In major advanced economy, it's twice more, between 2,500 and 3,000. In big emerging country, we are around 1,000, and in developing countries, under 500. Also with correction of internal power, purchase of power. So very quite dispersion. Example of some countries, because on the slide it's impossible to put all the country. Between it's also the monthly average wage growth. It means before the social taxes or all kind of social taxes in advanced and emerging countries. And you can see it's a wide range from United States or UK or South Korea or France. I put France, Germany also, and to Brazil, China, India, and Philippines. And from $3,000 to in Philippines something around 250. So the dispersion, inequality, I don't know, but dispersion is quite important. And because we are in Malaysia, so it was difficult to forget Malaysia. And you can see here, if I find that. Yes, I'm right. Here is Malaysia between South Africa, Israel, Turkey, Russian Federation, and so on. And afterwards, Egypt, Thailand, India, and so on. So inside the country, it can be a lot of dispersion. For example, the dispersion in India, surely it's more important, for example, that in Malaysia or, I don't know, Botswana or Chile. But in international comparison, it's important to see that. Some example of internal dispersion, price, wage price or wage dispersion. Well known is interdecile ratio D9 on D1, the 9 decile on the first decile, and as you can see on this this diagram, this graph, we have in Germany, in France, in UK, a small difference, a quite small difference, because it's really difficult. This interdecile ratio is not so often under 3 between the D9 and D1. 2.5, 2.7, 3. 3 it can be considered as not normal, but very quite low in international comparison. You see in UK more than 4, USA around 5, Filipinas, I didn't find Malaysia at the time of preparation of this PowerPoint, Filipinas 8, Latin America at 8, and for example, this Indonesia at 15. So in so-called emerging country, the interdecile ratio is more important. It's normal, something in the, for example, in France, in Europe, it was higher in the 60s and the 70s after the big growth in the aftermath of the World War II. And, sorry, just say, another possibility is to take the low wage rate since 1995 in percent, advanced country around 20%. Low wage rate, it means the wages in the vicinity of minimum wage, official minimum wage or real minimum wage. And South Africa and Latin America as example for advanced country. Another important topic, very interesting, but just 1 or 2 minutes because the condition of the PowerPoint, is the ratio of female wage, male wage, I mean the gender wage gap. And it's very interesting because France can be, as Germany or America, a lot of industrialized countries. As you can see, in the beginning, in the 50s, it was quite important. It means, for example, in the 60s in France, a woman, in average, was earning around 60% of a man. And this is decreasing, and now we have an, as can say, a situation, a blockade situation or something very, not very important evolution, and at 18%. But, this is a dispersion. It is an inequality. It's not so easy to say. In this case, we have to pay attention to a lot of bias, and the main bias is the qualification. It means I just take this this slide on the 1995, here on the right. The women and men are not the same number in the workforce. In France, in 1995, there are 12 or 13 million men and 7 to 8 million women at first. And at second, as you can see, you have almost the same proportion of employee and workers. I'm too late. No. I have to finish. Okay. 5 minutes. Okay, I will find. You have the same proportion of employee and workers between male and female. A lot of workers are male and a lot of employees are women. In the middle staff, you have also the same, but in the executive people, you have twice more men than women. So before, it can be inequality, but before, to jump in the inequality solution or inequality explanation, you have to take attention to this point. And as Kant said, in the developing countries and emerging countries, the difference between men and women is, for the time, more important. But with the qualification, we can hope, I'm sure, but I cannot prove, we have to come back in 30 years, that is, the women qualification is going higher and giving a better situation for the women and surely the gap reduction. And as Kant say, okay. So one word on the wage policy. A lot of policies are possible. This is a comparison between wage and inflation in France. You say it's not a real convincing evolution together. It's we are feeling something together, but not. Unemployment is very better. You see when the wage are decreasing, this is in relationship with the unemployment increasing, so the part of the workforce is important. But the best is the correlation to GDP and especially to productivity. This is a very interesting evolution. And in the wage policy, one point, because there are lots of kind of wage policy, this is a minimum wage. We have minimum wage in Europe since the 50s, not in every country, but since the 50s. And one, we are thinking in Europe, in this social year, that it is good for the wage owners that they have this guarantee of the wage. We have a legal minimum wage. So this part of employees, 10% of the workforce, and the minimum wage is half of the average wage, more or less, it depends on. So, but as you can see, sorry, as you can see on this graph, you have a lot of difference between Luxembourg, Belgium, or Netherlands, or France, and for example, Slovakia, Lithuania. Yes, it's, we are far away from an European and homogeneous minimum wage. They may finish? Okay. So, the best possibility to have a better wage is to make qualification. It's comparison with India. And conclusion, the importance of wage of the economy, the half of GDP can be not considered as something not important. The better link is with productivity and growth, and the importance of the public policy of wage, because this policy has to regulate the wage evolution. Also, unions and companies have important, and also the individuals. Individual person have to take care of their own qualification. And I think it's a good conclusion with the qualification. So I'm finished. Thank you. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Michel Pierre. I will give the mic to Muriel. Thank you very much.
Envisage the question of labor law and the comparison, little comparison between France and China. And I would like to begin with the first question. To remind us what justifies labor regulations? We must have in mind that the labor regulations find their justification in the particular position of the worker in this transaction. He is under the constraint to offer his labor. That is, there is no freedom on the labor market because the worker has no other alternative to make a living than to work for a boss. As a consequence, the boss is able to impose his conditions on the worker, even if those conditions are non-reasonable. By virtue of his power, of the employer's authority, he can impose an economic coercion on the workers, starvation wages, great number of working hours, bad or unsafe working conditions, etc., without the possibility for the worker to defend against, except by quitting. The boss's power to hire and fire leads to the worker's economic insecurity. That is, his life is depending on the decision of someone else. So labor regulations appears as the means to limit the power of the boss, to protect the party in position of subordination. Technically, it's called boss's legal liability without fault, which is the foundation of universal standard of labor regulations defended by International Labor Organization. So the purpose here is to investigate two very different countries, France and China, and how to question how they have built their labor regulation in order to answer the problem of economic insecurity of the worker, and further for what results. So we begin with France. Question might be posed like this: have we known the regulation for an over-regulated labor market? Because France is well known to be a country of hard labor regulation, a consequence of institutional innovation in all Europe continental countries at the end of the 19th century. That is the labor contract. Simon Deacon, who is a British professor of law at University of Cambridge, studies the consequences of this innovation, that is the creation of a specific statute for the worker as a mix of subordination to a boss and economic insecurity. In France, this institutional innovation led to group all the concerning laws concerning labor in only one book in 1910, in one book, Labor Code. The development and the extension of other innovations in the 50s, that is social insurances combined with labor code, led to create a social statute for the worker. To be a worker means stable labor contract, or as it's called, open-ended labor contract became the standard employment. And we must remind that those innovations worked together with the 30 years of exceptional growth after World War II. Next, please. But the rise of structural unemployment since the 80s has led to question this social consensus, and answers has to be found in reform of the labor law, with first diversification and expansion of employment relations, that is casual and temporary jobs during the 70s. They are considered as exceptions to the workers' standard statutes, but they are growing and growing. Second, innovation dedicated to these atypical workers become to occupy a growing part of the labor code, and it is at the origin of the development of a special part of labor regulation, which are called employment laws. The 19th were those of the law of the sharing of working time, as a new device to lower mass employment and to enrich the employment content of growth, and intensifying flexibilization of condition and employment. And since then, as you can see, we have an acceleration of reforms relative to labor market regulations. Clearly, the evolution of labor regulation in France are influenced by economists' motto, that is, flexible labor contracts must be favored as decentralized collective bargaining in order to minimize statute law. Consequence are that apart from the core labor force which profit from the statute law, we can see an explosion of short, casual, temporary contracts together with increasing of complexity of labor law. Generally speaking, we can see that this demonstrates a clear return to the unilateral power of the boss, as Nobel Prize awardee in economics of this year, Oliver Hart, has explained this concept of authority in the labor contract. So, lower the labor cost is another motto which led to permanent wage moderation under pretext of international competition and offshoring. And we can observe, maybe we have a chart, I suppose so. Next chart, no. Yes, that is the decline of the part of wages in GDP. A third evolution is the impetus to activate unemployment and social policies, and which did not concretize in sharp decline of unemployment. It's before the first one, excuse me. Not sharp decline of unemployment, but very expensive for public finances. So those reforms has been traduced in disappointing performances. Behind these results, we can find what I call the contestable economic approach to labor law. That is, modernized labor law does not deal with protection, but with efficiency in order to shrink the market malfunctioning. Labor law has to design a well-functioning labor market, and it needs only to design well-suited incentives in order to internalize the externalities, as another Nobel Prize award in economics, Jean Tirole, has said. An example of this new trend in regulation can be found in the 2006 new European goals, which are called flexi-security. And the European laws must be protective for all the people at work, whatever that situation. And labor law must concentrate only on wage labor, that is subordinate to a boss, but becoming the shorter part of the working people. Consequence is that we have a growing part of the working population out of the scope of labor regulation, but a growing situation of subordination to a productive organization designed by others. According to economists, it is a modern flexible labor market. Now, let's come to China. Yes. Here you have the main labor regulations, and you can find three waves in the 80s first, the 1994 labor law, and the 2007 labor contract law, major points. So, in the line with the willingness to restore the dialogue with the International Labour Organization in 1983, China started experimentation with labor contract in several localities. It recalls maybe need this, the other. Yes. Yes. No. Go back. So I said it recalled this method largely used in the 50s, that is experimentation of social innovation in a delimited area, then extension in several areas, and finally generalization of the innovation through a process that is not very clear. The first 80s regulations on the labor contract aimed at separate the worker from the state, and that is the introduction of fixed-term labor contract called Hatong Jugong, in order to organize the labor market between state sector, private sector. The subordinate situation of wage labor and the protection against economic insecurity are both the foundations of these first labor regulations. And the institutions of social security were established at the same times. The reaction of the state workers was a large resistance against what clearly appeared to be an attempt to the specific statute of an urban state worker, Jagong, that was called the Iron Rice Ball. The statute of Jagong was explicitly associated with economic security of the worker as a distinctive feature of the Chinese worker. And this first attempt to end this privilege can be considered as the origin of the 1989 Tiananmen Spring contestation and crackdown. After, in 1994, labor law was adopted, and it is the attainment of more than 60 years of efforts since the pre-revolutionary period in the 30s. And it is really the first real complete law dedicated to deal with the wage labor under a market organization in the labor exchanges. In line with 1992 economic turn, as you know, oriented toward liberalization of Chinese economy, the labor law focalized on individual labor contract as the own normal employment device, with the ILO values as a benchmark. Either for political or social stability motives, this labor law is a real progress for the urban workers. It contains a set of legal rights which cut clearly with duties, obligations, and political control under the previous Jagong's regulation. But with, sharp selection in the ILO values, that is, collective rights are clearly underestimated, and the right to found an independent trade union is forbidden. For the state sector, this labor law is the means to downsize the state-owned enterprises and to lead to their restructuration. Please. The labor law is the mean to organize, as we can see, the urban labor market. China has made the choice, as most of industrialized countries in the 19th century, the labor market has been designed by a specific institution, labor laws, as a protective device for subordinate wage labor. But this choice has been made only for a part of the working class. At the beginning of the 19th, the main problem was the reform of the state Jagong ties, and the problem of migrant was inexistent. Those peasant workers who are called Mingung was used to be hired in state firms since the 60s for temporary works, but it was under another labor contract, the Hwok. In this labor contract, peasant has been used to be hired in the new special economic zones, and as the number raised, the hiring without a labor contract became the rule. Why were they not considered by the labor law? Because of the existence of a strong discriminatory institution, the household registration system, and that institution prevent them to profit from the new labor regulation. So they were only offered the disciplinary side of the labor contract, never the compensation one. On va passer les graphiques. Second step of the construction of the building of the labor contract, the labor laws as an answer to the labor problem. As an American economist from the beginning of the 20th century, John Roderick Cummins demonstrated in his article, American Shoemakers, informal labor market engenders the competitiveness, that is, when the bosses can impose to all wages under the labor productive of the marginal worker. It creates the famous labor problems, that is, unemployment, pauperism, strikes, riots, etc. It posed the problem of social order. And for China, after the Tiananmen crackdown, which concerned only Zhejiang, the labor problem rose rapidly along with Mingong, that's immigrants from the countryside, becoming the major force, major labor force as a consequence of the insertion of China at the bottom of the global value chains. Recurrent strikes, riots, and labor shortages. The answer to this social instability has come under the labor contract law in 2007, whose aim is explicitly to restore the workers' bargaining power here for the Mingongs in order to lower the use of short and recurrent temporary labor contracts or the over-abused of detached workers in the state sector or in labor-intensive industry. Beyond, we can find the Mingong's demand for citizenry. Now we can question what is the meaning of law in China, which is not known to be a great democracy. The effect of this law has been explicitly, known explicitly to unexpected outcomes. That is over-mobilization of dispatch workers, which led to the 2012 amendment. And the rise of strikes and demonstrations, street demonstrations. But we can interpret that as a defeat of labor, but we can interpret it in another way. Fighting for the effectiveness of labor law in China is actually the only avenue to express workers' discontent in the absence of right to strike and to unionize and collective bargaining. So the migrants are taking the state at its words, and you have to make this labor law works, and that is what has been done. What we can say is that labor law in 1994 was a new contract offered to the urban workers and a means to discard the old working class, and the new labor contract law in 2007 can be interpreted as a new treaty with the new working class, that is with Mingong, and the objectives of this law has been attained. in China, we can observe raising wages and lowering informal labor market. And then we can, we are led to the conclusion that the history of labor regulation in France and China exhibits the same features: not to regulate capitalism, the regulation of labor market in France, no regulation for the Chinese Mingang, leads to social instability or the expansion of a second class of citizens, which one day or another will create biggest problem in stable social order. And that I want to conclude definitely, free labor market does not exist. That is, if labor is not regulated by dedicated laws, it is regulated by commercial laws, contract law if you prefer, which means nothing else than the law of the strongest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's switch to Malaysia.
Thank you, Elsa. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks to KRI and MFUC for this conference and for this opportunity to present research findings with you. We'll make a shift to a paper that is more empirical for research that was funded and conducted while I was at the University of Malaya together with Dr. Muhammad Abdul Khalid. I'm burning with curiosity, and I always like to start this presentation, with a survey, and it is also quite pertinent. So in a moment, I will ask your opinion about the pattern of inequality in Malaysia in the last 10 years. Okay? Whether you think it has increased, whether it has stayed the same, or whether it has decreased. Right? Don't overthink it, just whatever immediately comes to mind. And I just checked, neither France nor Malaysia have compulsory voting, so you may abstain. Right, so now, the survey, in this audience, how many of you think inequality in Malaysia has increased in the last 10 years? Okay, all right, just a general sense. How many of you think it has stayed the same? Okay, and how many of you think it has decreased? Okay, so I think it's fair to say that from the view from here, about half of you feel that it has increased, a smattering that it has stayed the same, and a substantial minority. But I think those who said it has increased, the margin over those who say it has decreased is bigger than Hillary Clinton's margin over Donald Trump. Most of you think it has increased, which actually is great, and it sets us up perfectly for this presentation. And this is generally, one of the starting points, that there is a perception, a view, that inequality in Malaysia has increased, and the view also in many countries around the world, and the kind of resonant theme of the times is rising inequality. Well, Malaysia's inequality has declined, household income inequality has declined according to Malaysia's official statistics. It's a puzzle because, as we can see in this room, most of us think it has increased. That's the background and motivation. The official data based on household income survey shows inequality declining, and phenomenally declining, as we shall see. But public discourse, perceptions, opinions widely hold that inequality has increased, or at least stayed the same. Now, what explains this kind of disconnect? Possibly, the perception of rising inequality may derive from dissatisfaction with wealth. Okay, so there's income, there's wealth, wages. There are different forms of income and ownership. But that's conspicuous. You can see that maybe wealth concentration is at the top, and the elite are, living very grandly, while others are struggling with living costs. It's interesting that having registered success that we shall soon see, the Malaysian government has not really recognized it very much, or even trumpeted that success as you might expect. So there's different dimensions of inequality. Household income, gross household income, which is also comprised of wages and self-employment income, as well as transfers, BRIM, social transfers. There's earned income, wages and self-employment, so the amount that flows in on some kind of regular basis, and there's wealth. Perhaps it's an issue that there are different inequality patterns if we look at the different forms of income. So these are the things that piqued our curiosity. But we face a major constraint in that the household income survey, which is a formidable data set collected by the Department of Statistics, 80,000 or so households, so it is the most authoritative data set. But it's not accessible for critical, independent, and academic research. That's my policy plug there. But we have to probe inequality with reference to other data which we compile, which are less comprehensive, than the household income survey. But we managed to find some that I think proxies that shed some light on personal earnings and wealth data besides the household income survey. So our key questions are, is the recent documentation of declining income inequality being overlooked? Is the government and the general population just generally ignoring it, not seeing what is happening? Or is it partially cited, meaning that it may be true, but there's also other things happening? So some inequalities may be declining, other inequalities may be increasing, or not declining at least. Second, based on available data, besides the HIS, has inequality increased in the 2000s, as indicated by the official account? So, as I was mentioning just now, if we, are there varying variations in inequality trends, household and personal, or the dimensions of inequality? So, this is the pattern, that we were talking about overall for Malaysia. The Gini coefficient here displayed between 0 and 1, and higher meaning higher inequality. And 4, 6, actually 0.4 is considered high, and 0.3 is considered low. So it is kind of within that range. Malaysia's declined from 0.6 to the lowest ever recorded level, just above 0.40 in 2014. It also declined in the urban areas as well as the rural areas. And this one is significant in the urban areas because most of the data that we have is quite urban-centric. Now, it may not look very steep, but the Gini doesn't move. It's got a narrow band. When we look at Malaysia's experience in international context, it becomes really very striking. With Thailand, it is one of, these are some anomalies, right, vis-a-vis major Asian economies like China, India, Indonesia, Korea, and a lot of the discourse about and evidence of rising inequality, comes from those countries, and they have been experiencing widening inequality over this same period. Malaysia's Gini coefficient shrank by 1.33% per year over this decade, exceeding an average of almost 1% recorded in 13 Latin American countries in the 2000s. Latin America stands out regionally in the world for having many countries that reduced inequality recently, but there is a storyline, that tallies with that it doesn't stand out in Malaysia. In Latin America, they underwent a leftward shift politically ideology and in the policy sphere. You see regime change and much more transformative changes that correspond with the declining inequality. Malaysia registered much higher decline in inequality, but that's not a compelling explanation for how it happened. Is the government disbelieving its official statistics? I will leave that as a question. It seems that what happened with the inequality, the data or the calculations based on the household income survey, it's not drawn attention to it officially in the policy discourses. In a way, perhaps it's because it's not really monitored and not really noticed. Aggregate inequality is more of a recent priority, as in targeting overall inequality. The national Gini coefficient as a policy target is a recent development. Or perhaps if you really highlighted how the bottom 40% has been phenomenally growing their incomes, it would undercut the rationale for the policy to provide a lot of assistance to the bottom 40%. This is just, some our inferences and best guesses about why it's happening, yet it's still quite odd that this staggering success story is the government is very muted about it. I think maybe a little bit more related to what we will do is what we do in empirically is maybe it is about being partially cited. That is, household income survey, and we don't really have a basis to dispute the figures except to say that it's quite implausible. But it may have declined, household income survey, but there are others, particularly personal earnings, wealth inequality. So here we get into the labor market and wage inequality, and wealth inequality as well. That may have increased, that may have stayed the same. And there's no information or degree of concentration at the uppermost and top end of the distribution, like the top 1%. That's something that's really crying out for more information, but unfortunately we know very little, and that could be the source as well about people feeling that inequality has increased. So the same data, but here presented, right, in the bracketing, bottom 40, middle 40, and top 20. Interestingly, in the economic boom of the 90s up to the Asian financial crisis, there was rising inequality. And so the bottom 40% grew slower, middle, and then the top 20% saw their household incomes growing fastest. And firstly, it's still, in spite of the boom, much lower than what we saw in the last 2 years. So something worth noting. But also, for that period, there was, like what I was saying about Latin America, a story that went with it, about why income inequality had risen. Right now, we see this declining inequality. It's still really striving, and no one is doing very well to explain why inequality has been declining. Some past research worth referencing here, which found that income, just highlight these two maybe, that earnings inequality, so wages, salaries, so self-employment income has increased, but household income remained static over this 97-2004 period, and over 89 to 97, earnings remain static, about the same, whereas household income inequality rises. So there is some precedent for them not necessarily moving in the same direction, meaning household income may move, inequality may move in one direction, personal income may move in another direction. In terms of the perceptions of inequality, that's something that it is subjective. So what kind of reference points? One survey that's worth noting here about from the Pew Research Center shows that Malaysians, most of them consider inequality a very big problem. 34% moderately big problem. So similarly, it's mirroring, I think, what we had seen here. Most still think that inequality has increased or stayed the same. Few feel that it has decreased. So what do we do on the empirics of this study? We gather data from different sources. Okay? And I will only I will just explain a little bit, and the findings will be very brief. I'm only covering the earnings inequality and not the wealth inequality. But the Employees Provident Fund accounts provide us a useful source. This is a registry with 6.5 million members, so we can see from the accounts, and a fixed amount of monthly salary is deposited into the accounts, and that applies across the board, and all private sector employees. It's mandatory to have an account, and this data also is published in the annual reports. So based on that, we set the premise that the changes in inequality in EPF accounts is driven by changes in wage inequality. We also look at public sector employment and vehicle sales as other proxies for earnings inequality. And this is what we find. So we have the registries. It's not survey data, but the disadvantage is that we don't have a comprehensive picture which has surveyed the entire country and looked at the different sources. We find, just to report the EPF then, a mild increase in earnings inequality based on the EPF savings accounts for about a decade. Okay. It's stabilized, and maybe this is the minimum wage effect, but not such a major effect of minimum wage, which I would say really took effect in 2014, although the legislation was passed earlier. But I think the overall trend has been one of slight increase. But as we carve it up a bit more into further details, this is really interesting, and a very clear trends here. So above 90th, that means the top 10, this is showing that the top 10% receive about 50% of the total amount of the EPF savings. And it is increasing on an increasing trend. The top 1% see also, I think, an even more marked increase in their share. And the bottom 50th, very slight. It's stable, okay, with very slightly decreasing. So there is some evidence here that there's an issue of concentration in the top 10% and especially the top 1%. Public sector employment, we don't have the data of the wage levels, but just the share of the public sector, which is about 1.4 million in the overall. And the share of top management and managers and professionals has increased, right? Now this, we cannot map it exactly onto how inequality is, the shape of inequality, but this is showing that there is a phenomenon of concentration at the top as well. And similarly with car sales, but I think we really have to rush on, so I will move just with a few concluding thoughts. So there is evidence of slight growth in earnings inequality and a concentration in the topmost strata, the top 10%, top 1%. And this is against what is, in contrast to what is reported in the official statistics of declining inequality. There is suggesting credibility to perceptions, critiquing the disproportionate power and material gains enjoyed by the top 1%. Malaysia labour market overall, possibly not seeing major increase in earnings inequality, but it needs further analysis using the HIS data, which remains the best source. Household income inequality may decline while personal income inequality rises due to transfers, multiple income earners, and so on. So we need to examine the HIS in corporate earnings and wealth inequality into academic and policy discourses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hwok. Now Junaidi will present in front of us the report, Khazanah Research Institute report on social mobility in Malaysia. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Right. Thank you. I wanted to start this by backtracking a bit in terms of looking at the overall income growth. Our previous publication on Khazanah Research Institute talk about exactly what Dr. Lee just mentioned in terms of the growth in terms of income distribution. So I don't think I want to repeat that. Then from there on, when we launched our Khazanah Research Institute State Household Part 2, we observed that there's a lot of good news in terms of the overall income growth, in terms of B40, as mentioned by Dr. Lee just now, in terms of the closing of the gap in terms of the Gini coefficient. And also we look at overall reduction in the hardcore poverty in Malaysia right now, which is at the lowest, around 0.6%. Then from there on, we wanted to look at certain issues we look at in terms of social mobility based on that data. What we did was that the Khazanah Research Institute did a study, a survey in terms of the mobility on 3 aspects: 3 dimensions: education, occupational skill, and income in terms of the overall social mobility in Malaysia. The survey was quite an extensive survey. We did about 25,000 surveys, but the result was that about 4,999 parent-child. The focus of the survey is looking at social mobility between parent and child. So the survey is a pairing in terms of the position of the parent as well as the first child. So that is the pairing that we did. The comparison is that looking at the parent born between 1945 1960. So in general, the Khazanah Research Institute undertake this survey in terms of looking at the situation of the parent around the age of 35 and comparing with the child born between 1975 and 1990, so that there's a similar comparison around the age of 35. So it is a similar comparison in that context. Secondly, we are focusing on, as I mentioned, education, occupational skill, and income, and how this actually influence in terms of the mobility on these areas. In general, first we look at perception. This is very important in terms of what I think Dr. Lee mentioned just now, but when he did that voting in terms of understanding, what do you feel? But when we did a perception, there is a general observation that 3 out of 4 parents believe that their children will fare better than their kids. Similarly, overall, we see that about 74% will feel that their children will fare better than themselves. And then in terms of looking across the races, there's the same sentiment in terms of looking at overall mobility of parent-child. There's a lot of anecdotes when the survey was done throughout Malaysia. Some are saying that it is more affordable to purchase goods and services, the education system, access to education, but at the same time there's some skepticism in terms of the overall growth in the country. For example, one of the important one is that difficulty in having access to education, the financing. When we then further on, when we did the survey, can I have the next slide, please? Right. This is comparing the education level between the parent and the child. Overall, there is a mobility around 62% with better education. The second, then at the chart number 5, at the percentage of children at this education level, we look at parents. The first bar is that the parents with no formal education, 33% of their children actually achieve tertiary education, which is quite high. And then as we follow on, comparing the parents' education and the child education, at the extreme end, 92%. Parents with tertiary education, 92% of their children would have tertiary education. As a whole, the percentage is about 6 to 62%. Next slide, please. All right. So then after that, we look at the segregation by race in Malaysia. The Chinese has the highest, about 44%. The Putra, 33% in terms of no formal education and the children having education. this is quite interesting for the Indians. Parents with no formal education, only 5% would have tertiary education. But try looking at the other side under the group for Indian. Parents with tertiary education for the Indian community, 96% will have tertiary education, which is actually the highest among the races. So this is quite an interesting observation. This is looking at the skill. Similarly, based on the survey, 37% of the parents feel that their children are better skilled than their parents. In terms of the separation of skill, we look again in terms of the overall, on the higher skill, 63% of children born to high skilled parents are also high skilled. Again, across the ethnic group, we observe that the percentage from low skill and moving to high skill is about, for Bumiputra is 25%, for Chinese 39%, and for Indian for about 19%. Could you move, please? Okay. In terms of income, we, as a whole, 1 in 2 children would, from this survey, earn a higher income than their parents. That's about 50%. What we've done is that for this survey, we look at the quantiles in terms of the separation of income. For children born in parents in top quantile, only 1 in 10 earn a higher income than their parents. That is quite low, but the lower one is higher. So most likely the children would earn higher than the parents in terms of the income comparison, right? Okay, this is an, I guess, the most important slide in terms of the overall. Looking at quantile, from the lowest quantile, parents' income, about 74%, the first bar, 74% children born in the bottom quantile have moved up. So this is the income mobility that is quite interesting for Malaysia, meaning that 74% of children of parents from lower income would have moved on to a higher level of income in terms of from the quantile perspective. Right. Out of this, 90% of Chinese born in the bottom quantile would move up at least 1 quantile, 73% among the Bumiputra and 62% among the Indian. Similarly, in terms of relative income, there is a movement. 42% of Chinese children born to parents in the top quantile have stayed at the top, 31 for Indian and 27 for Bumiputra. Okay. There's also this observation that in terms of the movement of the quantile, sometimes there would be a situation where you move, you have increased your income, but you maintain the same quantile. For example, when we compile all this, we observe that 35% of the children from all families would have moved up in terms of income quantile and income level. But 13% have stayed quantile despite having higher income level. So there is also intra-movement there. Oops, sorry. Right, this is an international study on intergenerational earnings elasticity. So for Malaysia, it's at 0.9%, meaning that in Malaysia, not more than 90% of children income is associated with the parent income. So in a way, what we're trying to say is that the beginning is not so important for Malaysia. So there is a lot of opportunities for the children to grow into a higher income and to be more socially mobile. Okay, a general observation from this survey for the B40. What are the factors in terms of outward income mobility? We observe that the high portion is on education and male children. Saving is important in terms of contributing, as well as the geographical location, the urban area. We also look at the top 20, the downward mobility. Children without tertiary education are more likely to have some form of downward income mobility. Female, this is interesting because just now we talked about gender in terms of wages. And also this is also interesting, children not raised by both parents. This is a social issue. And that Bumiputra children are more likely to be downwardly mobile than Chinese children. Okay, in summary, we observe that education is very important in terms of the overall social mobility. We also observe that in Malaysia, education mobility is very high. In terms of occupational skill mobility, 37% of children are better skilled than parents. And similarly, there's a similar observation in terms of the income. Okay, that in general is the overall aspect of the social mobility study.
Thank you very much for this positive view of the still young Malaysian society, especially from the old Europeans as we are. We maybe have time for some questions with the floor. Few questions, but I think it deserves really.
Thanks for the presentation. Dr. Lee, there's a lot of assumption that there is happiness in, when I hear a lot of people clapping when the household income has increased. But is there an academic yardstick that you measure? With due respect, I mean, in Australia, there's called the Henderson poverty line, where Dr. Henderson every now and then crafted a criteria. So let's say take a basket of food or rental in a particular time versus a different time. You then get a more accurate analysis of what poverty is or what the income earning is. And while you said that getting 25,000 of survey, that is a very, very, despite the fact it's a large, it's a very small analysis versus perhaps you can get the government to do a proper national census where we in Australia have every 10 years on August the 4th, the household does it. Then you can map it more accurately rather than the academic summation.
Thank you very much. Maybe Mr. Le Chevalier, we will take 3 questions, answer, and see whether we have time for some more. So please, could you please give the mic to the room?
Yes, this is a follow-up of the previous question, also a question to Dr. Lee. So I'm not sure I understood. So basically, you don't have access to the measure survey by the government, and my question is why? What are the conditions for your research? And also, I would like to know the government perspective on inequalities. Related to this, because you started with the observation that there is certainly a gap between the reality of evolution of inequalities and its perception by the population. Did you have a chance to look at some surveys on subjective data like ISSP, which is international survey asking the same question in different countries about do you consider that inequalities in your country are too high or not? And it may help you, especially in comparative perspective, to situate the position of Malaysian position, their perception, not only their perception of inequalities, but the importance they put on inequalities, and it may be related to government policy as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a question there. Maxime, au bout de la salle. Le monsieur. Le monsieur avait posé, le monsieur avait demandé avant. Merci.
Thank you. I'd like to address a couple of questions to Mr. Junaidi. Firstly, what are your thoughts on the marked limited social mobility of the Indian offspring children, okay, of parents, okay, who have no formal education in comparison with the other ethnic groups? Second question is actually a clarification. If I understand correctly, you're looking at a matched pairs of parent, okay? Parent and eldest child. If I understand correctly, the information on the second child was obtained through secondary, I mean, from interviewing the head of household. Was that correct? If that's the case, my question is, would the questions be asked of the eldest child, okay, who may or may not be resident in Malaysia? Okay? So for instance, okay, if there were an offspring, okay, an oldest offspring, okay, who were working in Singapore, okay, would the income of that child, okay, be obtained, okay, through the parental source, okay, and converted, okay, at the prevailing exchange rate, and then inserted into the Malaysian income distribution? Thanks.
Thank you very much. So maybe we will begin with these 3 questions on Malaysia case, and after we will take more questions, maybe dealing with Europe, if you want to question. And if you don't, maybe we will have the coffee break and you will ask directly the question to the scholars here. Thank you very much. So please.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Yeah, it's certainly a very current practice and a trend, and I think a positive move towards broadening beyond income. So mea culpa, this research is still very income centric, but to expand into the broader notion of happiness and sometimes even subjective assess happiness, just asking people how satisfied you are actually has been shown to be quite robust and empirically as a reflection of how people's well-being is. Another is to broaden to other indicators besides income, like into health and so on. It is a bigger discussion that we could have, but I think for information, in Malaysia, there the multidimensionality, looking beyond income into health and living conditions, is underway with multidimensional poverty index. So I think there are some positive moves in that direction. There was enough in this study just to unpack income alone. Surveys and census. So the census is something that has the power of knocking on every door if it's done so vigorously and very meticulously to get information of the whole population. But it's quite poor at getting information like income, because you just don't have enough time to really ask people those questions and really reliably collect data on income. But I think on others like occupation and so on, so we could look into that using the census. Basically, yeah, if the census can be reliable for certain things, but it's not so good in general for income. Why is HIS difficult access difficult? I think there's a general official stance of very guarding data in general, and awareness towards engagement with academia, and putting more things in the public domain. I think there are moves towards more engagement and making things more available in terms of the reports of data and even some data sets. But income, is more sensitive in general. So I think there's a longer way to go in terms of income data. Thanks for highlighting, I think, some of these other surveys. The Pew survey that was referenced is one of those international, but it would be good, and we should talk further maybe of whether Malaysia is represented in these surveys that go beyond just asking perceptions, but the value attached to having more equality and a more normative basis for the direction that policy should take. So thanks for highlighting that.
All right, thank you for the question. In terms of the result of the survey for the Indian population, we did not go further than that. It was just the objective of the survey is just to check on the landscape, So the survey question is just focusing on the situation per se, not in terms of the issues underlying it. On your second question, the parent and elder child, I think just to clarify, the survey is between the head of the family and the first child. Only that, not on the second child.
My question was that you have a parent-child matched pair, right? And the parent is resident in Malaysia, right? But the information on the child, again, earnings, etc., again, is obtained from the parent, right? But the child may or may not be resident in Malaysia. Is that correct?
Yes.
So in other words, you could have somebody, the child, again, working in Singapore, for instance, or Australia or United States, okay? So the information on the child's earnings is obtained from the parent, converted to Malaysian ringgit at the prevailing exchange rate, and that income is then inserted into the Malaysian income distribution. Now, I'm raising this because just as Prof. Jomo reminded us, okay, that yesterday, that if we leave out, okay, the very large migrant worker population, okay, it actually, distorts quite a bit, okay, our assessments of poverty as well as inequality in Malaysia. By the same token, if you leave out the Malaysian diaspora, okay, especially the professional diaspora, okay, countries like Singapore and other places, it might also introduce biases, okay, distorting effects, okay, into your analysis.
So thank you very much. I think that to be honest with the clock, we have to make the pause now. I just want to conclude this panel before the round of applause to our guests, and that to say that if labor is a subaltern dimension, less conflictual in Malaysia than in Europe or in the contemporary China of the capitalism, it does not mean that this situation is leading to a weak, bad, poor situation for the workers. The workers, and especially the employed workers, are constituting 75% of the labor force in Malaysia. And thanks to the sustained growth over the last 40 years, this subaltern position as an institution of labor among Malaysian capitalism has allowed quite rather good and positive condition for the workers and also for the destiny of their children. So I think it's, from our point of view, is a success, we can say so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elsa and our learned panelists.